Hello everyone. Um, my name is Uma Seturaman, and I decided to do the cultural immersion project on the Filipino culture. The reason I chose this group was my co-teacher is a Filipino, and I thought maybe a better understanding of her culture and her individual history would help me to get along better with her and would help me in the classroom to work with her. So I decided to go with studying about the Filipino culture. So let me start with the history of the Philippines. So as you can see, this is the first slide, which shows the map of Philippines in the world map, and this is a small black cluster of islands. It's called archipelago or something, and the history goes back to 50 million years ago. The island was formed by the island was formed by the volcanic eruptions. I'm still trying to navigate the system. Okay, so the island was formed by the volcanic eruption some 50 million years ago, and the early inhabitants were from the Asian mainland, who were Mongoloids, and also from the Borneo island. As you can see here, the Borneo island is right there next to the Philippines, and the inhabitants from those islands were basically Muslims, and the ones from the Asian mainland were Mongoloids, and also there were Spanish Christians and Chinese commerce and settlers who came to this island. And Philippines was found by a Portuguese explorer, Ferdinand Magellan, in the year 1521, and it was named after the Spanish King Philip II. Um, so it was under the colonial rule of Spain, and so after many years of Spanish rule, the inhabitants decided to uh, revolt against their rule, and this was under the leadership of freedom fighters like Jose Rizal and Emilio Aguinaldo, as you can see in this picture, the freedom fighters. And meanwhile, there was a war between USA and Spain over the independence of Cuba, and the war happened in the Bay of Manila, which was close to the Philippine Islands, and the USA won the war, as a result of which Spain decided to sell Philippines to America for $20 million, but America was not interested in having this island, so it was kind of in between stage where America was undecided about what to do with this newly acquired island. But then there was, after the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, uh, the US decided to wage a war against Japan with the help of Spanish guerrillas. And this is when the Filipino guerrillas, like locals, and this is when the Filipinos and USA teamed together to fight against Japan, and the war was won by US, and US later on decided to uh, grant independence to Philippines and in like 10 years, and eventually in 1946 Philippines transformed into a commonwealth to independent republic. So this is how Philippines got their independence from Spain and America. in 1946. So that was the information I gathered about their history. And also I thought of getting some interesting facts about the Filipino Americans who had settled in America. So then the interesting facts were like 1 in 5 Americans are Filipinos, and Filipinos are the fourth foreign-born immigrants after Mexico, India, and China. And the first documented Asian immigrants were Filipinos in the year 1587. So it goes way long back in history since Filipinos have been living in America. Filipinos had participated. 250,000 Filipino Americans are veterans of World War II, but they got the recognition and the benefits of veteran benefits only in the year 2009 under the presidency of Obama. Filipino leaders like Larry Itliong and Philip de la Cruz led the Delano grape strike that led to the formation of United Farm Worker Union in 1960. Although the credit usually goes to the Mexican farm workers like Cesar Chavez, and we celebrate a national holiday for him, but the real contribution was made by Filipino leaders like Larry Itliong and Philip de la Cruz. So was an interesting and important fact I realized about the Filipino contribution to the U.S. And Filipinos have an important contribution in the field of art, like very famous hip hop singers like Bruno Mars and B-boys. I'm not sure about B-boys, but I have heard many songs of Bruno Mars and I like it. So they are all of Filipino descent. 90% of Filipino Americans identify themselves as Catholics, Roman Catholics, but some of them do follow Islam. And they do not like to be identified themselves as Asian Americans due to a history long of exclusion based on skin color, and they were not given leadership or representation in many pan-ethnic Asian American organizations, so they like to be identified as a separate Filipino American group. And October is celebrated as a Filipino American History Month in USA since 1988. So these are the pictures of the freedom fighters, Dr. Jose Rizal and Emilio Aguinaldo. And these are the pictures of the Delano grape strike leaders, Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz. And these are the celebrities, I'm sure, which many of you would know them pretty well. So then after knowing a bit about the history of Filipinos, I decided to study the biography book about Dr. Jose Rizal, written by Asuncion Lopez Bantug. Asuncion Lopez Bantug. This book is interesting because the author was the grandniece of Jose Rizal, and many of the illustrations and stories and incidents covered in this book describes the childhood years of Dr. Jose Rizal and how it influenced him as an adult. So I thought this would be more relevant for my study. So, and there were many illustrations, so it was pretty interesting book to read. So reading this book, I found out that Dr. Jose Rizal was born in a very affluential family with engineers and lawyers and merchants. And his mom was also a very learned person and had a great influence on his childhood. She taught him Bible and early reading and learning skills. And She also read him an interesting book about the foolish moth, wherein she tries to warn him to stay away from danger by listening to the parents or moms. But then Dr. Rizal comes up with a different conclusion from that book, saying that um, he came to the conclusion with the fact that certain things in life was worth taking risk and is beyond living. So that's what was the conclusion for him after listening to the story of the foolish moth, told to him by his mom many times during his childhood. And this is the risk he takes later on as an adult by not heeding to the warnings of his mom and his brother. He decides to come back to his country, and then he uh, ends up having been court-martialed and sentenced to death. So this influence I thought was important to mention, because how certain childhood events have a impact on you as an adult. And the other people that influenced him as a child were the priests in the church and his brother and his colleagues. And then he decides to get higher education as a doctor, of eye doctor, and he travels the world, wherein he learns 18 or more languages, and he gets well versed in different languages, and he decides to write a book, a very famous book, in the name of the book's name is Noli Me Tangere, the meaning of which is Touch Me Not, for his countrymen, to awaken his countrymen and to empower them and enlighten them about their condition as a and to let them know that they need to wake up and fight for their freedom against the Spanish rule. But Dr. Rizal's view about freedom was very unique in a way that he respected the Spanish sovereignty, and all he wanted was more and better representation of his people in the Spanish government. Mm, but but then his ideology was misunderstood by the Spanish governors, and he was eventually against falsely framed as being traitor, and then he gets court-martialed and sentenced to death at a very early age of 35, which is kind of sad. But then he was able, through his writings of novels and his poems, he was able to spark ignite the spark in his countrymen about freedom and education, the importance of education and knowledge, and making them aware about the world in general. And that led to the path eventually of the independence of Philippines later on. So, so that was the story of that was depicted by his grand niece about Dr. Jose Rizal. And then I decided to move to the watching a Filipino movie, which was named The Gifted. The producer was John Joseph Tan, and the characters in that movie were Zoe Tuazon, Aika Tabayoyong, and Mark Ferrer. And I decided to watch this movie because, again, this movie was about two childhood friends who come together in middle school and high school, and it shows different aspects of their growing up in different families. Aika was from a poor family, and her parents were vendors in the local market, and they insisted upon her studying, her education. And Zoe was from a very rich merchant family, and she was pampered with luxury and all those things. So and also the fact that how they become friends, and then they have their small um, fights over things, and then they resolve it eventually, and they become friends, stay friends again for the rest of their lives. But then this movie was interesting in another way, that it had a twist in the last 5 minutes, and I will not like to tell you that story, that surprise. And I hope during this summer break, um, you get a chance to watch the movie. It was acted pretty well by Zoe and Aika, um, and it's an interesting movie with great ending, like with a surprise ending. So then I moved to learn about their Filipino culture. So let me show you a couple of slides here. This was the home of Dr. Jose Rizal in Calamba, and his shoes, and he was a very good craftsman. So those are the few things spinning top he did. And that's the cover of the book he wrote, No Lime Tanger. Was a very famous patriotic revolutionary book, I would say that. And this is the movie I was talking about. You can see the girl on the right was Aika, and the girl on the left is Zoe. You can just see in the attitude that, or the dress they're wearing, you can say which one would be a rich person and which one would be which one comes from a poor family. So then about the culture, I was thought of uh, studying studying about their their cultural organizations in America that is focused on their folk dances and their cultural events, that they organize many cultural events during the year in Bay Area in particular. And this is Dr. Lolita Dinoso Carter, who is the founder of Samahan Art and Education Center in San Diego. And her mission was to encourage Filipino youth to take pride and learn Filipino culture and dance forms. So then I was interested to learn what are the different dance forms that they do in Filipinos, and I came across a couple of them which seemed interesting, because the tinikiling, as you can see here, is something which I used to do as a child, like in my school days. So I was surprised, and like, how there are the similarities between the both our cultures, that we did the same dance form depending upon the geographical origin of that dance form. And then the other dance form was subli, which is done where the girls and boys, they wear some wide brim hats and use some symbols. So I thought maybe someday I can do this dance form with my toddler kids in my classroom, with the help of my co-teacher who is a Filipino. Uh, so the other dance forms I came across was the rice planting and the maglalatik, which is done with the help of the coconut shells. It's also an interesting dance form. Here are a couple of links about I saw on the YouTube, and if you have time and you're interested, you can watch those dances. It's pretty interesting and uh, fun to know. And then I moved on to the traditional dress the Filipinos wear. This one is the called Maria Clara, worn by women. As you can see, the material is silk and heavy, and it's pretty expensive. And later on, I find out that my co-teacher said, like, they wear it only for special occasions like wedding. And even my co-teacher doesn't own one yet. And then the barong Tagalog is worn by men. And then the most interesting part was the food that the Filipinos ate. And the traditional food would include a vegetable soup, rice, and a lot of dishes made up of fish and coconut milk. So that was a similarity between our culture and theirs, that we both eat rice as a staple food and food made from coconut milk. So I could see some similarities there. So that's their food, and that's the dish that's made from coconut milk, and it is called ginatan, and ginatan is a dish that they even serve during Easter feast. Uh, that's the special dish they share. So then, after the cultural event, I dis with the I was confident that I was familiar with the Filipino background. So, and I decided maybe this is the time I should start interviewing my co-teacher, which she agreed to do so. As you can see, the person on the right is my co-teacher, Miss Maria Belta, and Aravallo Garcia is her name. Her name is, one more time, my co-teacher's name is Maria Belta Aravallo Garcia, and she is the first generation Filipino immigrant, and I decided to focus on her childhood and compare it to the childhood of her own kids outside of Philippines when they grew in soils of Canada and Singapore. So that way, I thought it would be a broad way to understand the childhood of children that grew in their own country and in abroad. Um, So her name is Maria Belta, which was after her dad's favorite teacher, and Aravallo is after her dad's last name, and Garcia is her husband's last name. So she was born in Cebu province, and her language was Bisaya, and she was the second sibling of the four brothers and sisters she had. So as a childhood, she had a very big family, and she had a very close-knit community surrounded by a very close-knit community. And she had a rich experience as a childhood. She was a very naughty child, she remembers, and she would play outdoors, like play kites, climb trees, build houses, and she would often get in trouble from her parents for not listening to them. And she remembers her mom was the disciplinarian, a strict figure, and her dad was more of a soft parent. A couple of incidents she remembers was once she bit into her brother's shoulder, and for that she got spanked from her dad, and she took it very personally, and then she remembered not to do such things again anymore, but she would always talk about it to her own kids as a story. So she also remembers her mom's contribution and patience while raising her, and she says the one thing she would always repeat in the classroom that her mom would tell her is always be nice to people who make your life comfortable. And I really like that saying, and it makes so much sense to all of us. And then she also closely, fondly remembers about her birthdays, like how they would celebrate her birthdays at home was by her mom would make a special noodle called pancit, and that was shared with her neighbors, and her dad would kill a chicken and make a cross on her forehead with its blood as a blessing, and that's how they celebrated the birthdays of kids growing up. The way she remembers they would pay respect to the adults was by a gesture called mano po, and in which they would raise the right hand and place it on the forehead of the younger ones. They raise the right hand of the elders and place it on the forehead of the younger ones, and that's how they blessed the younger ones, and that's how they greeted the elders in the family. And that gesture was called mano po. Um, So the gender roles were similar to our culture, like males were dominant, they made important decisions, and the females were responsible for taking care of children. And the education was very important in her family, and the people who were educated with university degrees were respected and in the community. So education was very important to her, and she passed on the same values to her own kids and made sure they took education very seriously. So then after marriage, she had to move a couple of countries like Singapore and Toronto and Vancouver before finally settling down in Bay Area. And so she had her daughter in Singapore, and living in a foreign land or abroad, she made sure she was very overprotective towards her daughter. So she would always keep her at home with her, and she made sure her kids went to a Catholic school, uh, and also but she couldn't continue that when she moved to US because the Catholic schools in US were private and expensive. But she made sure she gave a rich religious upbringing during their childhood, like how she was raised back in her own home country. Maria is a Christian who's like a Roman Catholic, and she baptized both her children before their first birthday, and she celebrates Easter and Christmas with great detail and devotion. And the traditional food that is served after Easter is called the ginataan. The dish is made from coconut milk. So Maria believes in love, honesty, and integrity. She loves music. She has learned ukulele. I think the Filipino people in general, they love music. They learn instruments as kids, and all their gatherings are pretty loud and with music and dance, and they greet each other with great loud voice. But then the children respect the adults, and sometimes they would not look into the eyes of adults. That is a gesture of respect. And yeah, so these are the few facts I learned about the Filipino culture, and after doing my research, I was glad that some of the stereotypical BS I had about them was cleared, and the way I would address the children would be uh, different now. Like if a Filipino child comes into my classroom and is not looking into my eyes while talking, I would recognize it as a gesture of respect than being shy or introvert. And also, I would make sure that I interact with the parents and grandparents with respect and if the mom shows too much concern about the food of the child, like the lunch and snacks and the other habits of the child, I would be more patient and willing to share those informations, as I know in these culture the moms are very protective and nurturing towards their children and make sure the children have a healthy and nutritious life. So the the similarities between our two cultures were that, like, about our respect for adults, and then the expectations of males being responsible for the financial aspect of the family, and the females would take care of the kids. And the as I mentioned before, the differences were the I'm sorry, I'm losing my thoughts here, but yeah. Um, so the prejudice I had about these people were like, I thought, I was surprised to know that they spoke so many different languages and they had so many different dance forms and foods and other things. And I also thought that they would have some kind of a traditional dress like they would wear every day, like Indians we do. But it wasn't there. She said no, they would wear the regular pant shirts on everyday basis. So, and also the one thing I learned was how they take pride in being addressed as Filipinos and not being a guest of being Hispanic or a Korean. That really insults them because so I will be extremely careful before if I'm um, meeting a new person who I might think is a Filipino, but I would make sure uh, which country she comes from. So thereby respecting her culture and her history. Um, and also after this research I did about Filipino culture, I came to know that how the child growth and development theories formed by Bronfenbrenner's model and Erik Erikson's psychosocial model is so much applied in the situations of Miss Maria's childhood and Dr. Rizal's biography. Like, since Miss Maria had a great childhood surrounded by mom, caring mom, her sisters and neighbors, and her teachers, school teachers were very nurturing, and she even mentioned the teachers as second mom. So then she eventually decides to become a teacher herself.